The night was quiet, but Sandra Bullock could not sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy silence pressing against her heart. The world saw her as strong, graceful, and admired by millions, but inside she carried a weight no one else could see. It was not fame or success that troubled her, it was something more human. It was loneliness. The kind that creeps in when the lights go out and the applause fades away. Her phone buzzed with messages from her team, reminders of upcoming shoots and interviews. But she did not answer. She turned it face down on the nightstand, covering her face with her hands. For weeks, she had smiled for cameras, spoken with kindness, and given strength to others. But when she was finally alone, there was nothing left. The house was large, filled with art and beauty, yet it felt empty. Sandra walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood by the window. Outside, the city lights sparkled like distant stars. People were living, laughing, sharing meals together. She wondered when was the last time she truly laughed without forcing it. Her chest tightened, and she whispered to herself, "I don't want to feel this way anymore." That was when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't her team. It was a name she had not seen in a long time. Keanu! She froze, her hand trembling slightly as she picked it up. His message was simple, almost ordinary. "Hey, I was just thinking about you." "Are you okay?" Tears filled her eyes, not because the words were dramatic, but because they were gentle. In that small moment, someone had noticed her silence. Someone cared enough to reach out without reason. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to say she was fine the way she always did, but she couldn't. Not with him. Keanu had always seen past the surface. Even years ago, when they worked together, he had treated her with quiet respect, never blinded by fame or pressure. Finally, she typed back, "I don't know, Keanu. I just feel alone." She didn't expect him to reply right away, but within seconds, her screen lit up again. "I'm coming over." Her heart raced. She quickly wrote back, "No, it's late. You don't have to." But the message had barely sent when another one arrived. "I want to. Just stay where you are." Minutes later, Sandra sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around the glass of water she hadn't finished. The sound of her front doorbell echoed through the house. She hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly to the door and opened it. There he was. Keanu Reeves stood outside, dressed simply in a dark jacket, his hair slightly messy from the night wind. He wasn't smiling in that moment, but his eyes carried something warmer than any smile could. "I told you it was late," she whispered, though her voice cracked with emotion. "And I told you I'd be here," he said softly. He stepped inside, and without asking questions, without making her explain, he just sat beside her on the couch. For a while, neither spoke. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm, steady, almost healing. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "Keanu, why do you always do this? Why do you show up when no one else does?" He looked at her gently, his voice low but certain. "Because I know how it feels. I know what silence can do to a person, and I don't want you to carry it alone." Her tears fell freely now, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't hide them. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't say anything more. He simply let her cry, his presence steady like a quiet promise. In that moment, Sandra realized something. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was about kindness, the kind that appears when you least expect it, the kind that reminds you you're not forgotten. Outside, the city continued its restless hum. But inside that house, time seemed to slow down. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra Bullock did not feel alone. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly through the curtains, but Sandra Bullock was already awake. She had barely slept. Not because of worry, but because her mind kept replaying the night before. She could still feel Keanu's quiet presence beside her, his words echoing in her chest. "I don't want you to carry it alone." She walked into the living room, expecting the silence of her large home, but her breath caught. Keanu was still there. He had fallen asleep sitting on the couch, his jacket draped over him, his head tilted slightly. He looked peaceful, almost fragile in a way she rarely saw. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying not to wake him, but inside she felt a strange comfort. It had been years since someone had stayed. Not just visited, not just checked in for a few minutes, but actually stayed. There was something in that act that words could never replace. She tiptoed into the kitchen and began making coffee, her hands trembling slightly as the aroma filled the air. Soon she heard movement behind her. "You're up early." Keanu's voice was soft, almost like he didn't want to break the calmness of the morning. She turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair messy, his eyes still tired but gentle. "I didn't think you'd still be here," she admitted, her voice a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You didn't think I'd leave you alone, did you?" He said with a faint smile. She tried to smile back, but her eyes betrayed her emotions. "People always leave," she whispered almost to herself. He stepped closer, his expression serious now. "I'm not people, I'm me, and I'm here." Her heart trembled at those words, but before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. She looked confused. Who would come this early? Keanu stepped aside as Sandra walked to the door. When she opened it, there stood Daniel, the young boy from next door. He held a small notebook close to his chest, his eyes red as though he had been crying. "Miss Sandra," he said in a shaky voice, Can I sit here for a while? My mom's not feeling well and I don't know what to do." Sandra's heart broke at the sight. She bent down, her hands gently resting on his shoulders. "Of course, Daniel. Come in." Keanu watched quietly as the boy stepped inside, clutching the worn notebook as though it were a shield. Sandra guided him to the couch and sat beside him. "What happened, Daniel?" she asked softly. The boy wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. "She's sick again. She says she's fine, but I can tell she's not. I don't want to bother anyone, but I didn't know where else to go." Keanu sat across from him, leaning forward. "You did the right thing, kid. Sometimes the bravest thing is asking for help." Daniel looked up at Keanu, his small eyes wide with admiration. "You're Keanu Reeves," he whispered, almost forgetting his sadness for a moment. Keanu smiled gently. "Yeah, but right now I'm just someone who wants to listen. Tell me about your mom." As the boy began to talk about his mother, Sandra felt a lump in her throat. She could see the fear in his voice, the same fear she had carried in her own heart during her hardest days. She glanced at Keanu, and in that quiet moment their eyes met. He nodded as though telling her silently, "This is why we're here." The hours passed slowly but with meaning. Sandra made breakfast for Daniel while Keanu helped the boy sketch something in his notebook. Laughter filled the room, not loud but real, the kind that grows even in the middle of pain. Later, when Daniel left to check on his mother, Sandra stood at the window, her arms crossed tightly around her chest. "He shouldn't have to go through that alone," she whispered. Keanu stood beside her. "No one should. Not him. Not you." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. They weren't only tears of sadness. They were tears of realization that maybe her loneliness was not just her battle. Maybe, just maybe, her pain could help her understand the pain of others. She turned to Keanu, her voice breaking. "Why do you always show up at the exact moment I need someone?" His expression was calm but filled with something unspoken. "Because I've been where you are, and I know what it's like to wish someone had knocked on my door." Her heart tightened at his words. She wanted to ask more, to understand the weight he carried, but before she could, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his eyes darkening for a moment before he slipped it back into his pocket. "Everything okay?" she asked carefully. He forced a small smile. "Yeah, just life reminding me that peace never lasts too long." Sandra studied him, sensing there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. Not yet. She simply reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. Keanu squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, as the golden morning light filled the room, Sandra felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But deep down, neither of them knew what was coming next. The challenges, the secrets, and the choices that would test them both in ways they never imagined. The afternoon sun was sinking low, painting soft shades of orange across the sky. Sandra stood on her balcony, arms folded tightly, as her thoughts swirled in a storm she could not calm. Inside her home, Keanu sat quietly at the table, flipping through the notebook Daniel had left behind. The boy's sketches were raw, simple lines of a child's hand, but every page carried a story. A mother lying in bed, a boy sitting by her side, a small house that looked more like a shadow than a home. "He draws what he feels," Keanu said softly, his eyes still fixed on the pages. "Sometimes words are too heavy, but drawings, they tell the truth." Sandra walked back in, her heart heavy. "He's just a kid, Keanu. He shouldn't have to hold that kind of truth. He shouldn't have to carry fear like that." Keanu closed the notebook carefully, almost reverently, and set it on the table. "The world doesn't wait until we're ready, Sandra. Pain doesn't care about age, but kindness doesn't either. Sometimes it shows up when you least expect it." His words echoed in her chest, but before she could reply, the doorbell rang again. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a glance, uncertainty, almost caution. When Sandra opened the door, Daniel was standing there once more. This time his face was pale, his hands shaking. "Please," he whispered, "can you come? My mom—" She fainted. Without hesitation, Keanu rose from his chair, his voice calm but urgent. "Show us the way." Sandra grabbed her keys, her heart racing. They followed Daniel down the narrow street to his small, dimly lit home. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of medicine and dust. Daniel's mother lay on the couch, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Sandra dropped to her knees beside her, placing a gentle hand on her forehead. "She needs help right away." Keanu pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance, his voice firm, steady, every word deliberate. Sandra held the woman's hand while Daniel clung to her arm, tears streaming down his cheeks. "It's okay, Daniel," Sandra whispered, though her own voice shook. "You're not alone. We're here." When the ambulance arrived, everything moved fast, the paramedics checking her pulse, lifting her onto a stretcher, carrying her away into flashing lights and sirens. Sandra and Keanu stayed with Daniel until the house was silent again, except for the boy's quiet sobs. Sandra hugged him tightly. "We'll go with you to the hospital," she promised. Daniel shook his head. "They said only family can go." Her chest tightened. "Then we'll wait outside until they let us see her." Later, as they sat on a cold bench outside the hospital, Sandra glanced at Keanu. He was staring at the ground, his hands clasped tightly together. There was a shadow in his expression, something unspoken but deep. "You're thinking about something," she said softly. He hesitated, then looked at her. "Years ago, I was sitting in a hospital just like this, waiting for news I already knew would break me. Waiting for someone I loved who never came back." Sandra's breath caught. She had known pieces of his past, but hearing it like this in his own voice was different. "Keanu," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. He shook his head gently. "You don't have to say anything, just don't carry silence the way I did. Don't let it eat you alive." His honesty cut through her walls, and suddenly she felt her own tears slipping down her cheeks. She leaned against him, not for comfort, but for connection. Two souls, scarred but still standing, finding strength in each other's presence. Hours passed before a doctor came out and gave Daniel the news. His mother was stable, but she needed care, treatment, and time to heal. The boy clutched Sandra's hand tightly, relief washing over his face. As they walked back home together, Sandra glanced at Keanu. "Why do I feel like this is only the beginning?" Keanu's gaze was steady, his jaw firm. "Because it is. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on screens or stages. They're fought right here, in the quiet corners of life. And they change everything." That night, back at Sandra's house, silence filled the air again. But this time it was different. It wasn't emptiness. It was the weight of what they had just lived through. The realization that their lives had been pulled into something bigger than themselves. Sandra poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to Keanu. "Thank you for today," she said softly. He met her eyes, his voice calm but filled with something deeper. "Thank you for letting me be here." And as she looked at him, she wondered, was it fate that brought him to her door that night? Or was it something else? Something unexplainable but real? Neither of them had the answer, but both of them felt it. the beginning of a journey they hadn't planned for, but one they both needed. The following days unfolded like waves, calm on the surface but carrying strong currents underneath. Sandra tried to return to her routine, but something had shifted inside her. She found herself thinking about Daniel, about his mother lying in that hospital bed, and about Keanu, his voice, his steady presence, his shadows that she could sense but not yet see clearly. One morning, she walked into the kitchen to find Keanu already there. He was brewing coffee, his sleeves rolled up, his movements quiet and deliberate. Sandra tilted her head, watching him for a moment. "You know you don't live here, right?" She teased lightly, though her tone was softer than usual. Keanu glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Then why does it feel like I do?" His words caught her off guard, stirring something inside her she wasn't ready to name. Just then, the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice trembled as he said, "Miss Sandra, the hospital called. They said my mom is not getting better. She needs more than what they can do here." Sandra's heart sank. "We'll come to you, Daniel." "Just hold on." Within minutes, she and Keanu were on their way. The hospital corridors were cold and bright, filled with the faint smell of disinfectant. Daniel ran toward them, his notebook clutched tightly against his chest. "They said she needs a bigger hospital, better doctors. But we can't afford it." Sandra knelt, holding his trembling hands. "Daniel will figure this out." "I promise." Keanu's eyes darkened with thought. "There are always ways. Sometimes they aren't easy, but there are ways." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "She always told me to be strong, but I don't know how." Keanu crouched down to his level, his voice calm but firm. "Being strong doesn't mean you don't cry. It means you keep moving even when it hurts. And you're already doing that." Those words seemed to settle something in Daniel's heart, but Sandra could see the bigger storm. How would they actually save his mother? That evening, back at Sandra's home, she sat on the couch with her head in her hands. "Keanu, I can't just watch that boy lose everything." "I won't." Keanu sat beside her, his hand resting gently over hers. "You don't have to. But this won't just be about money. It's about time, patience, and standing by them no matter how hard it gets." She looked at him, her voice breaking. "You always say the right thing. But who stands by you when it gets hard?" For a long moment, Keanu was silent. Then, quietly, he said, "Most of the time, no one." Sandra's chest tightened at the honesty in his tone. She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Then maybe it's my turn to stand by you." He met her eyes. And for a moment, there was a fragile stillness between them. Two souls, both carrying unspoken scars, both realizing they might be each other's answer in ways they hadn't imagined, before the moment could deepen. There was another knock at the door. When Sandra opened it, she found an envelope lying on the ground. No name, no address. She picked it up, her brows furrowing. Inside was a short note written in hurried handwriting. "Stay away from this. It's not your fight." Her hands shook as she showed it to Keanu. His expression turned sharp, his calm eyes narrowing. "Someone doesn't want us involved. But why?" Sandra whispered. "Why warn us like this?" Keanu looked at the paper again, then set it on the table. "Because when you try to help, you sometimes step into shadows you didn't know existed. But this only means one thing. We're closer to the truth than we thought." Sandra felt a chill down her spine. The story wasn't just about loneliness anymore. It wasn't only about kindness and comfort. There were hidden layers now. Layers that could change everything. That night, as she lay awake in her bed, Sandra stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The letter, Daniel's pain, Keanu's scars, they were all connected somehow. She didn't know how yet, but deep inside, she knew one thing for certain. The road ahead would test her in ways she had never been tested before. And as for Keanu, he was no longer just the man who showed up at her door. He was part of something bigger now, something that pulled them both into a path they could not walk away from. The night after the warning letter, Sandra could not rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the words again, "Stay away from this. It's not your fight." Her mind kept circling back to Daniel, his pale face, his mother's fragile breathing. How could she turn away now? The idea felt impossible, almost cruel. She walked into the living room and found Keanu sitting in the dark. The only light came from the city glowing outside the window. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the note lying on the table. "You're awake too," she whispered. He looked up at her, his face calm but unreadable. "I've been in situations like this before. Silence is rarely just silence. Someone doesn't want the truth out." She sat down beside him, her heart pounding. "But this is about a boy and his mother. What kind of truth could be so dangerous in their lives?" Keanu leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes pain runs deeper than what we see. Sometimes the fight is bigger than the family caught in it." Before Sandra could respond, her phone buzzed. It was Daniel again. His voice shook on the line. "Miss Sandra, someone came to our house tonight. They were asking questions about you." Her chest tightened. "What kind of questions?" "They asked why you and Keanu were helping us. And then they told me to stop talking to you." The boy's voice cracked. "I'm scared." Sandra gripped the phone tighter. "Listen to me, Daniel. You're not alone. We'll come first thing in the morning. Stay inside and lock the doors." When she ended the call, her hands trembled. "They're dragging Daniel into this now," she whispered. Keanu's jaw clenched, his calm voice carrying a sharper edge. "Then it's no longer just about kindness. It's about protection." The next morning, they went to Daniel's house together. His small home looked even more fragile in the daylight. Daniel opened the door quickly, relief flooding his eyes when he saw them. His mother, still weak but recovering, sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders. "Two men came last night," she said quietly, her voice raspy. "They said I shouldn't trust strangers who pretend to care. But I know you're not pretending. I saw what you did for my son." Sandra sat beside her, taking her hand. "We're here because we want to be. No one can scare us away from that." Keanu stood near the window, scanning the street outside. "Did you recognize them?" he asked. The woman shook her head. "No, but I could tell. They weren't just random. They were watching." Daniel clutched his notebook tighter, his small voice breaking through the tension. "Why are they doing this? Why don't they want you to help us?" Keanu turned to him, crouching down so their eyes met. "Because sometimes kindness threatens the people who want control. But listen, Daniel. The fact that they're warning us only proves one thing. We're standing in the right place." The boy blinked back tears, nodding slowly. Later, as they walked back to Sandra's car, she glanced at Keanu. "You talk like you've lived this before." He was quiet for a long moment, then finally spoke. "I have. I've seen what happens when people try to silence kindness. I lost people because of it." She stopped walking, her heart pounding. "Keanu, what happened?" His gaze dropped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I loved once tried to help, just like we're doing now. She didn't make it through." Sandra's breath caught. She wanted to reach for him, to ease the pain in his eyes, but he straightened before she could. "That's why I won't back down this time. I won't watch another innocent life get swallowed by fear." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She realized then that this wasn't just about Daniel's mother anymore. It was about Keanu fighting ghosts from his own past, wounds that had never fully healed. That evening, they sat together in Sandra's living room, the silence thick with unspoken weight. Finally, Sandra broke it. "So what do we do now? Do we step back, or do we step deeper?" Keanu's answer came without hesitation. "We step deeper." Her pulse quickened. "And if it costs us something?" He turned to her, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Then at least it will cost us for the right reason." For the first time in years, Sandra felt both fear and strength in the same breath. Fear of what lay ahead, but strength in knowing she wouldn't be walking it alone. As the night deepened outside, the faint glow of the city wrapped around them. They didn't yet know the size of the storm they were about to face. But one truth was already clear. Whatever was coming, their lives would never return to what they once were. The storm finally arrived on a night heavy with silence. Sandra sat near the window, her eyes on the street, watching shadows move in the faint glow of the streetlights. She felt the tension pressing against her chest like a weight. Beside her, Keanu leaned back on the couch, calm but alert, as if he was waiting for something he had known would come. Daniel and his mother were safe for now, staying with relatives outside the city. Sandra had insisted on it, but she knew distance would not erase the threat. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed at the door. Sandra froze. Keanu stood immediately, his movements steady, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay behind me." She swallowed hard. "Keanu, what if it's—" "Then we find out," he interrupted gently. When he opened the door, two men stood there, their faces sharp, their eyes cold. One of them held the same kind of envelope as before. Without stepping inside, he tossed it onto the floor. "Last warning," the man said flatly. "Walk away." Keanu stared at him without blinking. "We don't walk away," the man smirked. "Then you'll regret it." They turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the air thick with threat. Sandra bent down and picked up the envelope. Inside was another note. "This ends with silence. Choose your side." Her hands shook, but Keanu's voice steadied her. "They want fear to make our choices, but fear won't decide for us." Later that night, Sandra sat across from Keanu, her eyes glistening. "I'm not used to this. I'm used to scripts, cameras, lines I can control. But this feels real. Too real." Keanu looked at her gently. "Life doesn't give us scripts. It gives us moments. And this moment is asking for courage." Tears slid down her cheeks. "And if courage isn't enough?" He leaned forward, his voice low but strong. "Then we lean on each other. That's what we do." The next morning, they went back to the hospital to check on Daniel's mother. The doctors explained her condition, serious but treatable if she could be transferred to a larger facility. It would take money, paperwork, and time, all things the family didn't have. Without hesitation, Sandra made the decision. "I'll cover it, everything. She'll get the treatment." Daniel's mother broke down, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you do this for us?" "You don't even know us." Sandra's voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Because I know what it feels like to be alone. And no one deserves to fight alone." Keanu stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on Daniel's shoulder. "This is what it means to live. Not just surviving for ourselves, but standing for others when they can't stand alone." It wasn't easy. The threats continued, whispers in the shadows, warnings at every corner. But Sandra and Keanu stood firm. Together, they made sure Daniel's mother was transferred, treated, and slowly brought back to health.